Good morning and welcome to LoveBabz LoveTalk. I'm Babz Rawls-Ivy. I'm delighted to have as my guest this morning Kelly Davila. She is the Senior Research Associate at Data Haven. And in this role, Kelly leads research and evaluation projects involving analyzing data and explaining findings in Data Haven's public and private partners. She's a lead author of Data Haven's statewide health equity report and is directing a number of other research initiatives at the organization. So her background is in public policy research, urban development, transportation planning, spatial analysis, and demographically informed policy research. She holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Iowa and anthropology from the University of Southern Mississippi. And she has a BA in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin. So this report came across my desk. It's the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed stark differences in how Connecticut residents are able to access the resources they need to maintain good health. These health disparities are rooted in broader inequities in education, economic stability, nutrition, housing, health, healthcare, and social context, all of which must be addressed in order to help communities to recover from the pandemic and promote resilience, according to a new report from Data Haven. So when this report, Kelly, came across my desk, I was immediately excited. It went to Paul Bass, but since Paul's taken a bit of a hiatus, it found its way to me. So the new report, titled Towards Health Equity in Connecticut, the Role of Social Inequity and the Impact of COVID-19, offers an in-depth analysis of the factors underlying widespread health inequities in the state, such as discrimination, poverty, and access to community resources. Among the most pronounced results of these are the gaps in life expectancy, which got my attention, where people born in neighborhoods just a few miles apart may see life expectancy gaps up to 20 years. Oh my goodness. The report is available online at ctdatahaven.org/health equity. The report focuses on 5 social determinants of health: education and economic stability, nutrition and hunger, housing and the physical environment, healthcare coverage and affordability, and the social context of healthcare. Each of these categories draws on relevant indicators from a wide range of data sources, including Data Haven's live interviews with over 32,000 randomly selected individuals across Connecticut. Welcome, Kelly.
Hi, it's good to be here.
This is a lot, Kelly.
It is. It's kind of a wide range of topics all lumped into one.
So what I'm most interested in is this life expectancy based on where you live.
Yeah, so we wanted to open the report that way because life expectancy is a pretty good indicator of health overall and of well-being. So yeah, as of 2015, 2 kids in Connecticut born just a few miles away could have such vastly different socioeconomic statuses and circumstances surrounding their birth and their upbringing that one could expect to live up to 20 years less than another born just a few miles away. So kind of starting with that observation, looking at that between neighborhoods within cities and then between cities themselves in Connecticut, the report kind of traverses an individual's life course from birth outcomes and the circumstances kind of surrounding their birth to education, employment, income, ultimately how they pay for food and housing, how healthcare is accessed, and then the social context of healthcare, which kind of looks at, not only just discrimination in all walks of life. We focus a little bit on discrimination within healthcare context there, but also kind of the health consequences of that socioeconomic status and the multiple factors that kind of contribute to health over time and how that plays into an individual's perception of health overall and their ability to access quality healthcare over the course of their lives.
So this is not unique to Connecticut. But the study is done here in Connecticut. But this is not unique to Connecticut. This is we can lay this information just about anywhere.
Right. Yeah. In looking at Connecticut, one of the reasons we wanted to do that was because when you just look at overall statewide statistics, things seem pretty rosy. So, for example, Connecticut has a higher high school graduation rate than the country overall, but if you start peeling back the layers, you begin to realize that not all students are enjoying that high graduation rate. The gaps between white and Black and Latino students is very wide. The gaps are much wider between special ed and non-special ed students, or students who are on free and reduced lunch than not. So, we wanted to take a statewide approach in an attempt to kind of state that when you look at just statewide statistics, it doesn't tell the whole story, and it certainly doesn't tell the story of equity.
So give me so what should we take from this data, Kelly? And what should we do what should we take from this data? What would we learn other than if I live in Westville and somebody lives in Newhallville? Is that what we're talking about? The difference in disparity, or is it not that simple?
It's definitely not that simple. We present a lot of information essentially to make the case that there are big structures that exist within people's lives that affect how they're able to access any kind of opportunity. So it's not necessarily just the zip code where you live or the neighborhood where you live. It's the circumstances that prevent some groups from accessing those resources versus others. What it really does come back to in every single instance. So we present lots and lots of data throughout the report, but all of it can kind of be boiled down to like the effects of systemic racism and oppression have been so embedded within these structures, education, hiring practices, access to healthcare, et cetera, that it's just simply not level. The opportunity for an individual to have access to quality opportunities is just not there. So it's not really as simple as just the neighborhood where you live. It's the reasons why that's the neighborhood where you live, and the reasons why the schools are the way they are wherever you live, the reasons why you might not have like health clinics in the neighborhood where you live. All of that stuff is kind of wrapped up into bigger structures.
Mm-hmm. So is this information that maybe the Board of Alders could use in terms of how they allocate resources? Is the allocation of resources a way to turn some of this around?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the big takeaways, at least that we were trying to communicate, is that you need to center equity in all of these policy decisions if you want to purport that people have equal opportunity at all. And by centering equity, that's, it takes a conscious choice to number one, see these data and realize that, like, okay, it's not that Connecticut has great high school graduation rates, it's that it's not good for everybody. So until it is, we can't claim that as something that's, a statewide, good mark for us. So it is something that we do hope policymakers can use. But even in more like local levels or community levels, is just being aware that these data are out there to measure the ways in which X, Y, or Z system is inequitable, and based on what? Based on race and ethnicity, based on age, based on income, based on whether or not you have kids. That information is out there for people to access.
So the I think what I found most stunning, Kelly, is the 20-year gap of your mortality. I find that's a whole generation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole generation that depending on where you live could be lost, or is lost. Not could
Right.
be, is lost. So how do we think about that?
Again, I think like that's the life expectancy indicator is a really telling one, because it's not just that you are born and there's a number of years that you have to live, like based on the day that you were born. It's those numbers are kind of estimated based on what is poverty like in the neighborhood where you live, where your parents live when you're born, employment opportunities, what are educational opportunities like, how have those things changed over time. All of those things factor into the estimation of life expectancy, in addition to like how often do people die young in your neighborhood today, such that, if a child born today, based on everybody who came before them, what can they expect? So there's some of that in there. And then there's also kind of separate estimates of like intergenerational mobility. So economic mobility, educational mobility, and then just like moving away to another area that might have different resources altogether. So when you take those two things together, you can kind of start painting a picture of like, what are the structures that do affect life expectancy? Because it's not set in stone. You can change those things. It's difficult to track how life expectancy changes over time, but it's possible to do at the small areas like that. But you need to do that by looking at all of the other indicators, your educational attainment, employment, poverty, access to resources like healthcare, recreation, things like that.
So Kelly, do you stack the data that we have in Connecticut up against the rest of the country? Like, how are we doing against Mississippi or California or Idaho or New Mexico? Or how are we in the overall scheme of things?
Right. So this health equity report just focuses on Connecticut. And we do that by kind of breaking the state up into different parts. So we can break them up into a system, what's known as the 5 Connecticut's, which takes kind of the cities, the wealthy areas, suburban and rural areas, and kind of that spectrum of like urbanness as a means to look at differences within the state. So we do that a lot in this report. We release every 3 years community indexes for Fairfield, New Haven, and Hartford counties, or those regions. That includes an index that we've developed that compares towns and regions and neighborhoods in Connecticut's major metro areas to other major metro areas in the United States. So in that context, Connecticut usually rates overall pretty well compared to other states, or the metro areas in Connecticut's rate pretty well overall compared to other similarly sized metro areas. But when we look at the neighborhood level, often we see that some of the poorest neighborhoods in Connecticut do worse than the poorest metros in the United States. So there's a really wide variation there, which just makes that disparity even more clear, that when you look at these kind of bigger areas, you tend to miss the equity issues that are apparent within neighborhoods, within cities, and between the towns themselves.
So Kelly, does it help that New Haven sits in the shadows of Yale, the Yale Hospital, the Yale University, the Yale Corporation, and then flanked by additional higher institutions of higher education? Does that help us? Does that make the data look, does that give us more in terms of how we interpret the data, or less?
Like, I don't think it boosts the numbers really. So, I mean, when you look at New Haven as a city, like, you're not capturing a lot of like the people who work at Yale. Many of them don't live in New Haven. You see that in the surrounding areas, you see that in the suburbs. So, when you look at a town level, you can kind of see the effect of that distribution of, say, employers and employees, which are also, that's another topic that we cover in those bigger reports for New Haven, Fairfield, and Hartford counties. But it does in a way kind of affect how you can perceive the quality of life in an area, because there are resources available. Like, we in New Haven have several healthcare centers that might not be available, say, in a rural area. You kind of have to take all of those things together, and that's one of the ways in which the survey that we run every 3 years, surveying Connecticut adults about like their perceptions of quality of life. So not looking at just how many X, Y, or Z things are there, like how many libraries are you, but do you use your library? Do you feel like that's a resource in your community? So we ask those survey questions, and we're able to look at that data and kind of see that there's less satisfaction in some areas, like social areas, when you look at cities and neighborhoods across Connecticut, between, say, a wealthier suburb and an urban area that might have different perceptions of like the quality of parks, for example. But then you see in other ways that, in urban areas, people rate the quality of their recreational opportunities higher than they do in suburban and rural areas. So we kind of have to take all of that together and look at, how does the built environment, among other things, employment opportunities, educational opportunities, how does all of that affect how a person perceives quality of life, and then look at how does it actually affect whether graduation rates are higher, whether employment rates are higher, things like that.
So Kelly, when you ask these questions to people, I would imagine that 18 to 20 somethings have a different answer versus childbearing folks in the ages of, I don't know, 30 to 40. and then the retiring folks on the other end between 55 and 70 have a different kind of answer these questions differently based upon what they need at this particular point in their life. Right. So how do you quantitate that information into all of this? Like, what's the breakdown?
So we can disaggregate by a number of things. So you listed several right there, right? So age is definitely one. We see lots of variation between younger people and older people. So in this health equity report, looking at access to healthcare, young people are more often likely to go without healthcare for some reason because they have to take care of another person, or they have to work, or they just didn't think it was serious enough. Whereas a person who's over 65 will be less likely to forego an appointment for one of those reasons. So we can look at age as a factor there. Another thing we look at is whether or not an adult lives with kids. And we see, for example, that housing insecurity is much higher for people who live with kids than people who don't. Food insecurity is another one. Transportation insecurity is another one. So that's one factor that we like to look at when we're looking at these indicators. Race and ethnicity is another one that we look at a lot. And you see big differences there in terms of like perceptions of the built environment. So perceptions of like, do you have a like good place for recreation? Do you feel like your sidewalks and streets are safe? Do you have access to quality parks? Things like that tend to vary quite a bit by race. Gender, of course, income levels. We look at each of the indicators by those groupings, and we do see it's pretty apparent that kind of based on a person's needs. So like with kids, there's obviously going to be many different needs that adult might have because they have children than if they didn't. But in addition to needs, there's just, opportunities that are not there for some groups versus others. And we see that in the data.
What I find most interesting about New Haven, Kelly, is that in any given direction, you can face abject poverty and astounding wealth in the same community, but just blocks apart, right? Seriously. Yeah. Like when you look at Westville, or you look at Beaver Hill, or you look at Newhallville, or you look at East Rock. I mean, they all sort of blend into each other, just a few steps. But it's striking how the inequity in wealth and access is very obvious from street to street. Was that a surprise, or is that common?
Yeah, so, excuse me, we see that within cities, and we kind of also see that between cities, right? So you see that between, say, like Bridgeport and Westport too. So it's not a phenomenon that's like relegated to just neighborhoods within a city. But often we see that that's related to redlining and to historic racial covenants. So in the community index reports, again, for Fairfield, Hartford, New Haven counties, we were able to look at areas that were historically redlined, that are technically not anymore, but look at that data and see like in areas that were higher rated, the population is predominantly white, the population is predominantly homeowners. So even though the words may not be in law anymore, in some places they are, but the legacy of that kind of lives on. So you don't have that wealth building opportunity when you have areas that are, that were historically redlined, that are now, 80% or more people of color, mostly renters, people who are not able to build intergenerational wealth through, say, housing, for example, which then also affects things like land use. So you might not have as many resources available in some communities. You might have more industrial areas instead of commercial areas, for example. So it's not a surprise. There's certainly historic precedent for that we see not only in New Haven and in Connecticut, but nationwide.
And even though redlining is outlawed or illegal, the effects of it is still there. It's still very much present.
Right.
Even though there's laws that say it's illegal.
Yeah. It's one of those situations where just by removing the words again from the books is not balancing anything. It's not implying any kind of fairness. It's just saying like, okay, you got us. We can't, technically do this by law. I think there have been a number of studies done, nationwide, one recently done on Long Island, that essentially exposes that brokers are still abiding by those regulations, even though they're off the books. So a homeowner who's a person of color might be shown different properties than a prospective homeowner who's white. That's certainly still happening.
So can this data speak to what people speak about when they say gentrification? Like, does the data change when different people move into different communities and the communities start to shift and change?
Yeah, it does. You can see that gentrification is a little weird because it can either be very slow or be very fast. And the way that you measure those two phenomena, whether it's slow or fast, is a little bit different. The data that we use, so we run our survey every 3 years. So we've got that kind of every 3 year snapshot. The other kind of publicly available data uses 5-year estimates. So it kind of washes out like a quick phenomenon. But there are ways to look at whether, for example, if the population of people between like 18 and 34 has increased in a neighborhood, that might be one indicator of gentrification. If income has risen quite a bit, if educational attainment, if you went from 20% of the people in the neighborhood had a bachelor's degree and now 50% do, that's an indicator. So that all that stuff is trackable. We don't do that necessarily in this report, but all of that data is trackable.
So when we come back to the, I guess, the phenomena of COVID-19 and how it disproportionately affects Black and brown people, and is it a Black and brown people thing or is it a poverty thing?
Poverty is one indicator that kind of tracks with it. So to be completely honest, we had this report written and then COVID happened. So we started to look at the ways in which all of the things we had written about applied to COVID and included a lot of that context in this report. And one of the most, I think, striking comparisons that we were able to make is there's a very high correlation between poverty and flu transmission. And a lot of that has to do with overcrowded households or just otherwise being in closer proximity with other people because it's a respiratory illness. So like much in the same way that COVID is transmitted through kind of close contact, especially indoors, flu is transmitted the same way. So when poverty tracks closely with flu, you want to look at like all of the other things that track closely with flu. And because of poverty, you're also looking at things like employment rates. You're also looking at things like educational attainment. So historically, when you have groups of people, Black and brown people specifically, in Connecticut, Black and Puerto Rican people specifically, who have not historically had the same opportunities to for education and for employment, at higher rates of poverty, lower rates of health insurance, higher rates of overcrowded housing, you have more flu transmission. And now we're also seeing you have higher COVID transmission. So in addition to that, you've also got more Black and brown people who are working in essential industries. And then, on the flip side of that, you also have more Black and brown people who were laid off or who were unemployed, who are spending more time at home, perhaps with more people. We see in the data that they're, I want to say like 4 times higher rates of overcrowding in Black households compared to white households, and maybe 3 times higher in Latino households compared to white households.
Because we have a lot of people living with us.
Yeah, and I mean, and then part of that too is renters are more likely to live in overcrowded housing, and Black and brown people are also more likely to be renters. Women are also more likely to be renters. So all of these factors are kind of converging into this phenomenon right now that we're seeing in the pandemic. All of these things are becoming very apparent, and certainly now we've got more people looking at those patterns than maybe had before, who maybe had thought about them, but it wasn't very apparent as to the fact that, like, in a pandemic, the same systems that cause poverty are now causing inordinate deaths among certain communities.
Wow. So, okay. Were you surprised at that? Is this new for this kind of health crises? Do you see this with other health crises?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's new. But I think because so many more people who had never really had to consider things like unemployment or poverty certainly found themselves in those positions, whether temporarily or not. It became something that people said, like, wow, maybe this is a factor, or maybe this is like, there are people who had never experienced unemployment before realizing that it sucks, and then beginning to think about what are the kind of factors that might play into this long term. People begin to worry about, like, will my job come back, or will I be able to pay rent, is something that a lot of people hadn't really had that problem until recently. So I think it's inspired a little more empathy. COVID has inspired a little more empathy among the broader population than previously. But was it a surprise to learn that poverty and associated factors contribute to poor health outcomes? No. And part of the reason we wanted to write that report was to say, like, all of the ingredients are here, and we're aware of all of them kind of in pieces. Graduation gaps might be a story that you read in the news, or poverty rates might be a story that you read in the news, but to see all of that together and strung along an individual's kind of life course, resulting in poor health outcomes during birth and in childhood and in adulthood, during birth with, low birth weight, during childhood with things like asthma or lead poisoning, and in adulthood with just any number of chronic illnesses. All of these things, all of those factors were always there. So now it's just a matter of, now we have that information in front of us. What do we do with it?
So talk to me about nutrition and hunger and how the data shows what that looks like in these times.
So it's a little tough to track post-COVID, right? We know that like DSS is kind of overwhelmed with applications for SNAP benefits right now. But even before that time, we saw food insecurity certainly elevated among Black adults, Latino adults, adults with kids, women. Food insecurity tends to be associated also with things like transportation insecurity, so an inability to get a ride if you need one, or no access to a car. General financial insecurity, difficulty paying for housing, things like that. Housing and food insecurity are very closely related. I think Matthew Desmond was the person who kind of like popularized the phrase, the rent eats first. So in low-income families in particular, you might see those two, housing insecurity and food insecurity, side by side, because it's usually a trade-off, one or the other.
And you're starting to see people feel this because of COVID. People who ordinarily would not have this issue are feeling this issue, because if you can't go back to work, that affects how you pay for food, how you pay your rent or not pay your rent, and other quality of life things.
Yeah, I mean, you see that now too with food banks just having unprecedented demand. I mean, I think all of us saw pictures in the news of just like miles and miles and miles of cars at food banks. That kind of demand had just, there has always been high demand for food banks. Unfortunately, that's something that our society has just not figured out how to adequately supply everybody with sufficient food. But then you have mass layoffs, and then you have people who are worrying like when or if they'll get another paycheck, because of, a couple of months ago, I don't think anybody really knew what the deal was as far as reopening was concerned. So you see that unprecedented demand at places like food banks that is kind of matched by this like overwhelming demand for SNAP applications. And right now we're kind of at this point where we can see the end of those benefit expansions. A lot of the benefits for, say, unemployment are running out next month in July. Are we going to see that same demand grow again when people lose, additional unemployment benefits or additional SNAP benefits?
Mm-hmm. Wow. And so talk to me a little bit about access to health care and what that means in all of this. So does that mean that does it help communities to have healthcare centers in their communities?
I think by and large, yes. But there's also just kind of a broader problem of like access to health insurance. And then also just health insurance in the United States is incredibly complicated. And having insurance doesn't mean that you can actually afford healthcare. But because employers tend to be the biggest distributors of insurance, right? Like 60% of people in Connecticut who have insurance, they get it through their employer. So when you have people suddenly without employers, you have a lot of people suddenly without insurance. And marketplace insurance can be, it is very expensive, especially if you have newly low income or no income. You might qualify for some programs like Medicaid temporarily. But again, just having that insurance doesn't guarantee access to medical care. So in a way, having health clinics available in communities is a way to overcome that lack of access to health insurance, depending on how your health insurance operates. Again, like, because health insurance is so complicated, just having a doctor in your neighborhood doesn't mean that that's the doctor you could see necessarily, depending on your insurance. But in general, we saw in the report that simply having health insurance was usually an indicator of overall quality of life that we'd seen in other parts of the report.
So you fare better off if you have some kind of health insurance.
If you were higher income, you tended to have more insurance. If you were higher income, you also tended to have better neighborhood, or rate your neighborhood resources more highly. If you were higher income, you tended to have better education. So all of those things kind of like feed off of one another. Mm-hmm. But we were especially interested in looking at discrimination in accessing healthcare. So you might have insurance, but you might not want to go to a doctor because you are worried that you might be treated badly, or that your symptoms won't be taken seriously, or that you simply won't get treatment. So again, to like bring this back to COVID, there was a study done recently of a few states, of which Connecticut was one, early in the pandemic. So this was like February, March, looking at charts for Black patients and white patients. And by and large, white patients got things like COVID tests ordered way more often than Black patients. So that discrimination, that we survey adults and ask if they feel discrimination in healthcare settings, you then see that in the data that show that, yeah, they're not being given the same resources when they do see a doctor, especially in a public health crisis like this.
Wow, this is fascinating. So, so your hope for this data, Kelly, is what? What do you want people to do with this?
So again, I think just kind of placing it all in one area, in one report, was one of the objectives, to illustrate the point that all of these systems are interrelated, and they all kind of tie back to the same element of like, racism has affected the way education is accessed. Racism has affected the way that housing is accessed. Systemic oppression in general has just influenced every part of our lives. So when you lay all of that out in one place, kind of beginning with, look at these two neighborhoods, life expectancy varies by, 15 years between the Hill and Westville. Okay, let's look at all of these other indicators in between. And then look at, we end the report with self-rated health, like just how do you feel your health, the quality of your health is. And all of the groups that we have seen have experienced, inequitable access to all of these opportunities, rate themselves the lowest in terms of self-rated health. So we wanted to bookend the report that way, and lay all of that information out. So I guess like the goal then would be, okay, knowing this information and knowing that we can track this stuff. This is not just data that's one point in time. It's something that's collected over time. We can begin to look, if we center equity in our policy decisions, we can begin to then track, like, okay, do groups who have lower high school graduation rates today, in 10 years, if we make some change, are they rating themselves higher in terms of self-rated health? Is the life expectancy of their neighborhoods improving? All that stuff is trackable. We also have some just recommendations in there for just like kind of no-brainer stuff in terms of, competency training for healthcare professionals. There really should be no reason why like two different people get different kinds of healthcare treatment.
Like, for example, when Black women go to the doctor and we say pain, our pain is never taken seriously. That somehow or other we don't feel pain. That's one example. The second example is when the infant mortality, the childbearing Black women, across all economic indicators, fared terribly having babies than anybody else.
Right. I don't have the number in front of me, but I want to say it was something like maternal mortality among Black women was something like 4 times higher than the average, and then of white women. That's all in part. All of that is wrapped up in just perceived discrimination, and then just like medical training that focuses on infant health in childbearing situations versus maternal health. So you can still die of preeclampsia. You might have excellent insurance. There are stories about this. Like you could have fabulous insurance and have like excellent prenatal care and still die of preeclampsia because the doctor's not paying attention to when you say something about your body doesn't feel right. And that's just something that should be treated as an inability to act responsibly in a medical setting. It's not something that is, there's no rule, there's no law saying that you can't give patients the same treatment or listen to a patient when they have, when they tell you about symptoms or when they are experiencing pain. So we make recommendations like that, kind of in the healthcare setting. And then just in terms of like removing barriers to access to social services is another big one. That, it's kind of tied up with like how the federal government will regulate things like SNAP benefits, for example. The state can't just increase those benefits necessarily. So we do make some kind of specific policy recommendations like that.
So you go in and say, when you look at the data, you say, listen, if you just do this thing, this will help this over here. Yeah. That's what you mean?
Yeah, we try to make it clear like that, but also just state like, when you make a decision about housing, you have to think about decisions made in terms of education. When you make a decision about food insecurity, you have to think about housing affordability. So all of these things, employment opportunities, all of those things are interrelated.
So, New Haven right now is experiencing a housing boom. I mean, there's apartments going up every 2 feet. Right. I don't know how much of that is going to be affordable or accessible to people who historically has not been able to access these kinds of living situations. But does a housing boom like that affect the data? Does it, when we have more housing, does that say to us, oh, look, we have more housing, so there's no reason why people shouldn't be able to get housing?
No, I mean, I think that there's like, there's certainly a demand for just more housing units, right? Like the vacancy in New Haven is also pretty low. So while more units should be built, that is a decision point where you can center equity in that conversation and say, like, do we really need more housing that's like $2,000 a month, or that's located only in these 2 neighborhoods? I think there's some of that is like private market, and some of that is like, what can the city do? It gets really like, housing is one of those just really complicated things, because it's essentially like a market that we just live in, but don't have a whole lot of opportunity to affect, especially because in Connecticut, like each municipality is responsible for those decisions, as opposed to like thinking about them in a regional context. So looking at like, how do we coordinate housing between like Hamden and New Haven? That's not really a conversation that is going on necessarily. So, I mean, housing is tough. I think there is certainly a demand for it, but it has not historically been centered in equity, that discussion.
Okay. So before we go, Kelly, talk a little bit about some of the top recommendations that you make in this report from some of this data.
So I guess, like, in specific terms, I think there's a need to do things like expand eligibility for insurance. Right now, lots of immigrants and all undocumented immigrants are just ineligible for insurance, which today, living in a pandemic is just, it's
insane.
Cruel. Right. It's cruel. I understand that's complicated, but I mean, I can say that about all things. I understand making the policy decision is complicated, but it's something that we certainly recommend happens, that more people have health insurance, more people have access to more affordable health insurance that's not going to cost them 25% of their income. So that's one recommendation. So currently SNAP benefits, they were set to change. Benefits were set to change. Eligibility would have been reduced on April 1st, but because of the pandemic, that's been put on hold. Another recommendation would be like, just do away with that rule in the first place. Don't revert to it once the pandemic is over. And what that would do essentially is, right now there are some waivers for SNAP benefits saying that like, if area unemployment is higher in some places, then eligibility is greater in some places. And that's really to control for like, in cities in Connecticut. So in like the larger cities in Connecticut, unemployment is, 3 or 4 times higher than what you might see in other places. So that rule is an attempt to control for that. So keeping that from happening, keeping that eligibility from being reduced would be another recommendation. Clearly, like for healthcare practitioners, just really basic stuff in terms of like competency training and reducing the experiences that patients have of discrimination in healthcare settings would be a big one too. And then kind of on like your like sweeping policy levels, housing reform in general, just across the country, but like certainly in Connecticut needs to change. Housing should, like, evictions are a huge crisis. I can't wrap my head around like the possibility of what evictions might look like when rent moratoria are lifted next month, which is also the same time that unemployment expansion ends. So you suddenly have rent due, but also less income than you did a couple of weeks ago. So that is certainly another area that the eviction moratorium should be extended, if not just like completely. I don't know what the solution is for that. It really is going to be chaos when that happens.
Because where would these people go? And if
you're supposed to shelter in place,
and you have to shelter in place, and if the landlords start, eviction processes, where can these people go? Like where can these people go? Nowhere. So something has to be done so that people can continue to shelter in place, because COVID is with us. There's no cure. There's no vaccine. And flu season is coming back around in October. And I don't even want to say come back around because it's still very much with us. So, I find this whole conversation quite fascinating. And I appreciate the time that you took to come and talk about this. If people want to know more, Kelly, how do they access this report?
So our website, ctdatahaven.org, /health equity will get you health equity reports, /reports will get you our community index. If you just go to the main page, ct.datahaven.org, all of that stuff is kind of available for you to select from that main page.
All right, I'm going to put it in the chat room. Is CT Data Haven?
Yes.
Oh, I put the wrong thing. Okay. So what's the next study that you do, and how often do you do studies? And I'm sure this COVID thing is going to capture your attention for quite some time until we come to some resolution about this.
Yeah. So COVID is an ongoing thing that we're looking at and tracking. So we've got, right now the team is working on analyzing survey data that's coming out from other organizations, just looking at like how people are coping really. And we're putting that information out there. So on our Twitter, that's probably the best place to kind of see that information as it pops up. So that's at CT Data. We're also in the middle of, releasing or working on some equity reports at the town level, or perhaps groups of towns for the smaller towns, that might incorporate some of the data that we used in this health equity report at a more local level. So in the health equity report, we don't necessarily go down to the neighborhood level. The town reports would give us an opportunity to kind of do that.
Wow. Well, I'd like you to come back on a regular basis periodically and just like keep us updated, because I think this is fascinating, because I don't think I don't know where people would have opportunity to talk about and listen to the data in this way and laid out, and it's very user friendly. Thank you very much. Like, I didn't feel like I couldn't keep up, right? Like, you feel like, oh my God, this conversation is way over my head. I felt like this was in very ordinary layman's terms about what we're seeing. And I think COVID-19 provides a unique opportunity for us to sort of look at all these disparities, because COVID has really illuminated, for me at least, and the circle that I run in, has illuminated all these disparities, whether it's access to healthcare or food deserts or housing, that it has really illuminated all the problems. Like, we knew these problems, but COVID just put them on steroids.
Yeah, it certainly has like shined a light on them, and also has just made the impact of them so much more severe than pre-COVID. I mean, like, that's another thing. This report has data that was all collected before COVID. So it's also has just made the impact of them so much more.
Oh, sorry about that. So, all right. Well, Kelly, Davila, I so appreciate you, and say hi to your folks over there for
sure,
for letting us have this conversation. Thank you so much. I hope you do come back, and let's set up another time for you to come back, and let's talk more about this and unpack this a little bit more, because I think this is quite just quite fascinating, the data and the disparities in health, and the life expectancy based on where you live. That is
yeah, that's something we can talk about all day. That's a big topic we study here.
That is quite eye-opening. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And she will be back, everybody. So thank y'all for listening and doing your watch party. People are doing watch parties and things like that. So thank you so much for tuning in this morning. I've been doing a series of these pandemic conversations, but from different perspectives. And this certainly was one from analysis perspective that no one is talking about. So thank you so much. Harry, we're out. Thank you. I'll be back tomorrow, y'all.
spinning to the morning light, spinning to the morning light, spinning to the wheels keep spinning, wheels keep spinning to the morning light, spinning to the wheels keep spinning, wheels keep spinning, wheels keep spinning to the morning light, spinning to the wheels keep spinning, wheels keep spinning, wheels keep spinning to the morning light, spinning to the